My name is Pat Grant. I'm a comic book maker. I do some writing, do some design work, and I teach in animation. I live in Wollongong, New South Wales, and I work at UTS in Sydney. I've always loved making things. I've been an artist for my whole life. Really, the art that I always wanted to make was stories. I became a storyteller before I became a visual person or an illustrator. I used to love to draw when I was a little kid. Really, I love to read. I love stories. I love learning about how they work. And so all of my art making practice, all of my image making, that only exists in service of story. You know, I had this sort of nerd part of my life, which was, you know, sitting at home and reading science fiction and watching movies when I could. But I had this other part of my life, which was sports, and so I kind of grew up in like a surfing beach community, and so I was always at the beach, spent a lot of time riding waves and skateboarding, and my social world was very sports oriented. And in surfing and skateboarding, there's big graphic culture, so I was heavily influenced by skate graphics and the surf graphics and things I was seeing in magazines. And comics didn't really come into my field of view until I was in my 20s. So I was actually really, it was like I knew comics were there. It was like I knew they were waiting for me. But when I was younger, I couldn't really afford to buy comics. There was no comic store in my town. I didn't know kids who were into comics, and so it was like I knew it was there, but I would have never called myself a comics guy until I made a really clear decision in my early 20s that I was going to go deep on comics and figure out what this world was. Yes, well, I am in fact a doctor of comics, but that by no means that by no means makes me an expert. In fact, when people ask me about what's happening in comics these days, I feel utterly inadequate. So I don't consider myself to be like someone who's really particularly broadly read in comics. But the thing that I do know a lot about, and that I do spend like a huge amount of my professional time thinking about is how we make comics. And that's part of my teaching practice, but it's also part of the things I'm interested in reading about and the things I'm interested in writing about. The thing that I think I'm an expert at is talking about creative practice. And there's not a lot of people in comics who can talk about what they do when they're making comics, or what other people would do when they're making comics. So that's what the whole doctor thing is all about. So a big, massive part of the way my ideas sort of visualize themselves is like the experience of being in the landscape. And I mean, that's so not unusual for an Australian storyteller. That's like the quintessential part of Australian storytelling. This is I grew up in a beach town, but it was the first settlers were timber getters, and this is an old sawmill. Steam-powered sawmill that was out in the bush on the way to the beach. They were kind of lying around there. This is absolutely my hometown, and the place where I was living when I was kind of really trying to think through some of the stuff that was confusing about the conceptual work of the book. This tunnel here is a real tunnel. So I wrote this book which is about coastal town racism, and I didn't know what it was really about until years and years later. When you're trying to make a book about something that feels like it's the conversation at the time, by the time you went through this torturous process of making a graphic novel, that conversation would be over, and then people would pick up the book and go, this again, I'm so sick of this. But actually, the migration conversation has escalated over these 8 years and become more hysterical. This piece of artwork is becoming more and more relevant to me, the person who made it, because I'm more confused about like Australian politics now than I ever have been. Yeah, it's really nice that you can make a thing and it can teach you something even after it's been published. So this new book, The Grot, which is coming out, it's got all of these tableaus of horror, you know, like it's like climate fiction. It's like this sort of really disgusting, hot, sweaty future, and there's a lot of poverty, and there's a lot of disease. It's a grim place to live. People keep saying to me things like, "Man, this is like so dark. This world you're drawing is so dark." But for me, I feel like everything in the book is something that I see every day, you know, and living in the world and being drawn to like disgusting places that are just everywhere in our suburban landscape. Every time we go somewhere and actually pay attention, is a massive part of The Grot. That's like, yeah, a huge contribution to the scene setting in that book. The real core of the story is con artistry, set in this sort of future metropolis where the basic trust between humans has eroded intensely, and these two boys, Lippy and Pen, they arrive in this city and they're trying to set up a business, and kind of seems like everyone in the whole city is trying to swindle them, and they can't figure out who to trust and who not to trust, and that's kind of the core of the story. So you can find more of my work at patgrantart.com. If you want to read the first 2/3 of The Grot, you can check that out at thegrotcomic.com. You can read Blue, my first book, online, boltonblue.com, and my Instagram is patgrantart. I think that's about it.